Apache woman who escaped the forced labor camp collapsed at Cowboy's cabin door. The sun rose over the rugged hills of the southwest, painting the desert in shades of gold and brown. Among the dusty paths and sharp rocks, an Apache woman moved quietly, her bare feet brushing the dry earth. Her name was Naeli, which meant "I am enough" in her language, and she carried herself with the strength of her people, even though the world around her had grown cruel and unrecognizable. Once, the land she walked had been free, filled with the laughter of children and the songs of her tribe. Now, soldiers' patrols and the presence of government camps had turned her home into a place of fear and sorrow. It had been only a few days since the soldiers had come. They had ridden into her village with heavy boots and stern faces, their rifles glinting in the sun. Naeli remembered the sudden shouting, the confusion, and the way her mother had tried to shield her younger brother, her hands trembling. They had no choice but to follow orders and leave their homes behind. Naeli had watched as her family was separated, sent to different camps, and her heart had thumped painfully in her chest. She had tried to remember the comforting warmth of her mother's embrace, but that memory was now tinged with fear. The camp where Naeli found herself was far from the life she had known. It was surrounded by high wooden fences, and guards patrolled it with sharp eyes. The other captives were a mixture of men, women, and children, all of them weary, hungry, and quiet. Every day began with the harsh cry of the guards and ended with exhaustion that left the body sore and the mind heavy. Naeli learned quickly how to move silently, how to avoid drawing attention, and how to hold on to a sliver of hope even when her stomach ached with hunger. Work in the camp was never-ending, for she and the others were forced to perform labor in the fields or buildings, lifting heavy loads and following orders without question. Some of the soldiers shouted cruel words, mocking them for their heritage and speaking in languages that Naeli did not fully understand. She had heard stories from elders about the days of the Apache before the camps, when their people roamed freely, hunted with skill, and lived in harmony with the land. Those stories gave her strength. She reminded herself that the suffering would not last forever, that the spirit of her ancestors flowed through her veins, giving her courage when her body grew weak. Even in the camp, Naeli noticed small details that reminded her of her old life. The scent of sage in the morning, the way the wind moved across the desert, the distant cry of a hawk. These things were tiny sparks of freedom that no fence or soldier could take away. At night, when the sky was filled with stars, she would lie on the hard ground and remember the stories her grandmother had told her. They spoke of brave warriors, wise women, and the importance of protecting their people and their land. Braish. Naeli whispered these stories to herself, almost as if saying them aloud would give her the courage to survive and escape one day. The days were long and the labor was tiring, but Naeli learned to be observant. She noticed when the guards changed shifts which paths led to the edge of the camp, and which areas were less watched. Her eyes became sharp, her senses keen, for she realized that the land, even under the watchful eyes of the soldiers, was still a friend to those who knew it. Each crack in the fence, each shadow, and every distant hill became part of a mental map she carried with her. But life in the camp was not only physically challenging, it was emotionally draining. Naeli had to see people she cared for struggle and suffer, unable to help them as she wanted. She watched as others lost hope, their spirits breaking under the harsh conditions. But Naeli refused to give up. She reminded herself of her purpose, of the life she had once lived and the life she wanted to reclaim. Every small act of kindness, every shared piece of bread, and every whispered word of encouragement among the captives strengthened her resolve. Despite the fear, Naeli began to notice the resilience of her fellow captives. A young boy, no older than her brother, learned to find edible plants around the camp. But an older woman taught the children songs and stories, keeping the memory of their culture alive. Naeli found comfort in these small acts of defiance and creativity. They were reminders that even in the darkest times the human spirit could survive, One day, Nayeli was assigned to a particularly difficult task. She had to carry heavy bundles of wood under the scorching sun, the sweat running down her face and burning her eyes. Her muscles ached, and her feet were raw from the long march across rocky ground. But as she walked, she noticed a distant canyon, its edges jagged and wild, untouched by the soldiers. She imagined herself running through that canyon, free and unafraid. The thought gave her a small, flickering flame of hope. She knew that if she could survive this day, she could survive the next, and perhaps one day she could find a way to leave the camp altogether. Patience. Nayeli also remembered the stories her mother had told her about the Apache warriors who escaped from soldiers in the past. These stories were not just tales of bravery. They were lessons in patience, observation, and careful planning. Nayeli began to think about how she might use the lessons of the past to secure her own freedom. She learned to notice patterns in the soldiers' movements, to predict when they were most distracted, and to find the small moments of opportunity hidden within the strict routine of the camp. Even in the worst moments, Nayeli found ways to maintain her spirit. She would close her eyes during brief rests and picture the mountains, rivers, and forests of her homeland. She remembered the sound of her mother singing at dusk and the taste of berries picked fresh from the desert. These memories were not just comfort, they were fuel. They reminded her of who she was and what she was fighting for. As the weeks turned into months, Nayeli grew stronger, both in body and in mind. She was no longer just a captive. She was a thinker, a planner, someone who refused to accept the limits imposed on her. She learned to move quietly, to avoid the watchful eyes of the guards, and to communicate subtly with others without drawing attention. Her determination became contagious, inspiring a few of the other captives to hold on to hope as well. Through it all, Nayeli never lost sight of her ultimate goal: freedom. She knew that escaping would not be easy. The desert was harsh and the soldiers were relentless. But she also knew that her people, her culture, and her spirit were worth every risk. Every day she survived in the camp was a day closer to reclaiming her life, and every hardship was a lesson in patience, courage, and endurance. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in soft oranges and purples, Nayeli sat against a rough wooden fence and watched the shadows lengthen across the camp. The other captives had already settled into their meager sleeping arrangements, but Nayeli remained alert, her mind alive with plans and possibilities. She thought about the stories of her ancestors, the paths through the mountains, and the distant freedom that awaited her. That night, as the wind whispered through the camp, Nayeli made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would not be broken. She would find a way to escape, to return to the land of her people, and to live again with the dignity and freedom that had been taken from her. The challenges ahead were immense, but Nayeli's spirit was stronger. Redeemed as survival, courage, and cleverness would guide her through the days to come, and so, under the blanket of stars, with the cool desert wind on her face, Nayeli closed her eyes for a brief breath. She dreamed of freedom, of open land, and of the day she would walk unafraid through the mountains of her ancestors. Even in the darkest corners of the camp, even under the harshest sun, hope remained alive in her heart. The sun had barely risen when Nayeli began to think about what she had learned during her months in the camp. Every day had taught her something new. When the guards were less attentive, which corners of the camp offered a little cover, and how to move quietly without drawing attention. She spent long hours observing the routines of the soldiers, noting the times when their attention drifted or when the shadows of the fences hid the smallest movement. Each observation was like a small piece of a puzzle, slowly forming a picture of how she might escape. She had watched the other captives give up, their shoulders slumping under the weight of hopelessness, and she refused to let herself become like them. Nayeli knew that her mind had to remain sharp, her body strong, and her spirit unbroken. Each morning she woke with the determination to survive another day, and each night she planned the next step of her journey. But she would wait for the right moment, one that she could sense in the way the wind shifted, the way the sun cast shadows across the ground, and the quiet lull of the guards' movements. The idea of escaping was terrifying, but it was also exciting. Nayeli imagined the freedom that lay beyond the camp's walls, the wide open spaces of the desert, the cliffs and canyons she had known as a child, and the forests that whispered stories of her ancestors. Her heart would race at the thought of running through the land she loved, but she also reminded herself that the desert was dangerous. The sun could scorch the earth, water was scarce, and wild animals roamed freely. Yet these dangers were nothing compared to the life she endured in the camp, and she knew she had to take the risk. Over the next few days, Nayeli began to prepare carefully. She moved silently during the early morning hours, collecting small pieces of wood, dried herbs, and a little food she could hide in her clothes. Breaths. She learned to identify plants that could help her stay hydrated, and even noticed which rocks could provide shade from the relentless sun. Her mind was constantly working, imagining every scenario and predicting what might happen. She knew that one small mistake could cost her freedom, or worse. One night, as the camp lay quiet under the glow of the moon, Nayeli watched the guards change shifts. Their movements were predictable, and the shadows of the fence created areas where she could slip unnoticed. She had spent weeks memorizing the layout of the camp, noting where the watchtowers stood, where the gates were reinforced, and where the ground was soft enough to make her footsteps nearly silent. Her pulse quickened as she realized that the time to act might be very soon. The moment came unexpectedly. One of the guards, distracted by a conversation with another soldier, left a section of the fence less guarded than usual. Nayeli had observed this moment for several nights, and now it was her chance. She waited, crouched low in the shadows, her heart beating like a drum. Every sound seemed louder than usual. The rustle of dry leaves, the distant howl of a coyote, and the whisper of the wind through the fence posts. She took a deep breath, remembering her ancestors' teachings about patience and timing. Then, carefully, she moved forward, step by silent step. Her feet pressed softly against the ground as she approached the gap in the fence. She paused, listening for any sign of the guard's attention. The desert air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sage and dry earth. Nayeli's hands reached for the rough wood, feeling for the weak points she had memorized. Slow, careful, she slipped through the opening, holding her breath the entire time. The outside air felt like a gift, filled with the possibility of freedom, and she almost smiled despite her exhaustion. Once outside the camp, Nayeli had to move quickly. She knew the desert would be unforgiving, and she had no time to waste. She ran through the rocky terrain, her feet bruised but steady, guided by the rising sun and the natural landmarks she had known since childhood. Breaths, choosing instead to follow dry creek beds and the shadows of cliffs. Every step was a mixture of fear and hope. Breath. She could hear the distant sounds of the camp behind her, the faint shouts of soldiers who had begun to realize she was gone, but she kept running, driven by the thought of freedom.
During the first few hours, Nayeli's energy carried her through the desert.
She climbed steep rocks, crawled under fallen branches, and paused only briefly to drink from a small spring she had remembered from her childhood. The water was cold and sweet, reviving her tired body. She allowed herself a few moments to catch her breath, listening to the desert around her. The call of a hawk, the rustle of small animals, and the whisper of the wind. The world outside the camp was alive, and for the first time in months, Nayeli felt like she belonged again.
But the desert was not without its challenges.
The sun rose higher in the sky, making the rocks hot under her bare feet. She had to find shade wherever she could, moving from one shadow to another. Her throat was dry, and she rationed the water carefully, knowing that she might not find more for some time. The wilderness required patience, and Nayeli was learning that survival was not just about speed, it was about understanding the land and respecting its dangers. As she moved deeper into the desert, she encountered small animals, lizards, rabbits, and birds that reminded her of the life that thrived even in harsh conditions. Desk. She observed them closely, learning from their movements, noticing which plants were safe to eat and which areas offered protection from the sun. Her instincts, honed by months of observation in the camp and years of growing up in the wilderness, guided her steps. She became part of the land in a way she had never been able to inside the camp. Nayeli also had to avoid human settlements. She had heard stories from other captives about towns and ranches where strangers were not welcome. People in these areas were often suspicious, and encountering them could mean being returned to the camp. She moved quietly, staying off the main roads, and only traveling when she knew the risk of being seen was low. Each careful step was a lesson in patience and strategy, and she began to appreciate the skill it took to move unseen through a world that seemed determined to control her. Nightfall brought new challenges. The desert, which had been hot and bright during the day, became cold and dark. She huddled against a large rock, pulling her thin blanket around her shoulders. The stars above were brilliant, and Nayeli felt a sense of awe at their beauty and consistency. They reminded her that the world was much larger than the camp, that there was still a place for her outside of the fences and guards. She used the stars to navigate, remembering the lessons her grandmother had taught her about reading the night sky. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by the sounds of the desert, the howl of distant animals, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional gust of wind. Nayeli dreamed of her village, of her family, and of the life she hoped to reclaim. Even in her sleep, her mind worked on plans, imagining the safest paths, the hidden water sources, and the areas where she could rest without being discovered. Her dreams were a mixture of memory and hope, guiding her toward the freedom she sought. By the second day, Nayeli had covered a significant distance. Her body ached, but her spirit remained strong. She found small patches of berries and edible plants, and even a small stream where she could refill her water supply. The desert, while harsh, offered what she needed if she paid attention. Every plant, every rock, and every sound became part of her strategy for survival. She was learning to trust her instincts more than ever. Along the way, Nayeli also thought about the people she had left behind. She remembered her younger brother, her mother, and the other captives who might still be suffering. The thought of them fueled her determination. She promised herself that she would survive not just for herself, but for the memory of her family and the hope of reuniting with her people. Each step forward was a step toward reclaiming the life that had been taken from her. By the third day, Nayeli's journey became even more challenging. She faced steep cliffs, thorny brush, and patches of sand that slowed her progress. Her body was tired, but her mind remained alert. She rested briefly under the shade of a large rock, drinking from the water she had carefully rationed. But she observed the desert around her, noting the safest routes and the areas where she could hide if necessary. Each decision was critical, and she knew that one wrong move could undo all her progress. Despite the difficulties, Nayeli felt a growing sense of confidence. She had escaped the camp, navigated the desert, and survived where many would have given up. Her skills, her knowledge of the land, and her determination had brought her this far, and she knew they would carry her further. She began to see herself not just as a captive or a fugitive, but as someone capable of shaping her own destiny. As the fourth day approached, Nayeli noticed a distant structure on the horizon, a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. Her heart skipped a beat. The cabin could be a danger or an opportunity.
She considered her options carefully, remembering the stories of travelers who had been helped by strangers and those who had been turned away.
Desk. After a long pause, she decided to approach cautiously, staying low and using the rocks and shrubs for cover. She would need help soon, and this cabin might be her chance to rest, recover, and plan the next stage of her journey. Naeli moved slowly, her body weary, but her spirit resolute. Each step brought her closer to the unknown, and yet the promise of safety, even temporary, filled her with hope, patience, courage, and observation. These lessons had guided her through the camp, across the desert, and would guide her now as she approached the cabin. Naeli's legs trembled as she neared the cabin she had seen from a distance. Her body had endured the scorching sun, the rocky terrain, and the long days of walking, but now exhaustion weighed on her like a heavy cloak. Any step felt heavier than the last, and her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She clutched her small bundle of herbs and dried berries tightly, knowing it was all she had left to sustain her. Every muscle ached, and her lips were cracked from thirst. But the sight of the cabin, smoke curling from its chimney into the clear blue sky, filled her with hope. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing surrounded by desert brush and jagged rocks. Its wooden walls were weathered, the paint faded by years of sun and wind. A thin plume of smoke drifted from the chimney, signaling that someone lived inside. Naeli slowed her steps, crouching low behind a cluster of rocks, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement. But she could hear the faint creak of the cabin door, perhaps from the wind, and the distant call of a bird echoing across the valley. The cabin might be a lifeline, or a risk, but she had little choice. She needed water, food, and shelter. Her body finally gave way just a few steps from the door. Breath. Naeli collapsed onto the dry earth, gasping for breath. Her legs had no strength left, and her vision blurred. The desert that had felt like freedom only hours ago now seemed endless and merciless. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook violently. Tears filled her eyes, not just from pain, but from the relief of being so close to help. She whispered a silent prayer to her ancestors, asking for strength and guidance. Inside the cabin, the door creaked open and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the worn clothes of a man accustomed to life in the wilderness. His hat shaded his face, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the desert around him. The man noticed Naeli immediately, lying on the ground, barely moving. For a moment, he froze, unsure of what to do. Strangers were rare in these parts, and he had learned to be cautious. But something about her, the way she had collapsed with utter exhaustion, stirred a sense of compassion in him. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. Naeli's eyes flickered open, and she tried to speak, but no words came. Her throat was too dry, her body too weak. The man knelt beside her, offering a hand. "Easy now," he said gently, his voice calm and steady. "You're safe here." "Don't try to move too fast." Naeli's small hand reached for his, and she felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no other choice.
He helped her stand slowly, supporting her weight as they moved inside the cabin.
The interior was modest but cozy, with a small fireplace, a table, and a few chairs. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the simple decorations and the warmth of a home untouched by the harshness of the desert. Naeli's eyes roamed the room, taking in the sights, but her focus quickly returned to the water the man had brought her. She drank slowly, savoring the cool liquid as it ran down her throat, bringing life back to her tired body. Once she had recovered enough to sit, the man prepared a small meal for her. He offered bread, dried meat, and a few vegetables. And Naeli ate ravenously, her hunger from days of travel, making every bite a blessing. The man watched her quietly, giving her space but remaining nearby in case she needed help. His presence was steady and unthreatening, a stark contrast to the fear she had felt in the camp and the loneliness of the desert. As she ate, Naeli began to regain her strength, and the man spoke softly, asking simple questions about her journey. He did not press for details but wanted to understand her condition and needs. Naeli answered cautiously, careful not to reveal too much. She did not yet know if he could be trusted fully, but she felt a growing sense of safety in his calm demeanor. He reminded her that not everyone in the world was cruel, and that sometimes help could be found in the most unexpected places.
After the meal, Naeli rested near the fireplace.
The warmth of the fire seeped into her tired muscles, and she felt a sense of peace she had not known in months. She thought about the days she had spent walking through the desert, the nights under the stars, and the endless fear of being caught. But now, in this small cabin, she realized that survival was not just about escaping danger. It was also about finding moments of safety, of care, and of trust. The man, whose name was Jeremiah, began to talk about his life quietly. Lived alone, he explained, raising cattle and tending a small garden.
He had learned to rely on himself, to live with the land rather than against it.
He shared stories of the desert, the wildlife, and the changing seasons, and Naeli listened intently. She realized that she had much to learn about surviving not just the wilderness but also the world beyond her tribe. Jeremiah's calm presence was a reminder that not all men were threats, and that kindness could exist even in a harsh world. As the evening passed, Naeli felt her eyelids grow heavy. She wanted to sleep, but her mind was restless with memories of the camp, of her family, and of the long journey still ahead. She thought about the Apache lands she had left behind, the mountains, rivers, and forests she had known since childhood. Those memories were a mixture of sorrow and hope. They reminded her of what she had lost, but also of what she was fighting to regain. Jeremiah noticed her restlessness and offered a gentle suggestion.
"You've come a long way," he said.
"Rest tonight. Tomorrow we can talk about where you'll go next."
"Right now, you need strength." Naeli nodded, grateful for his understanding.
She curled up on a simple bed, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The fire crackled softly, and the sounds of the desert night drifted in through the open window. She allowed herself to close her eyes, letting the warmth and safety of the cabin soothe her weary body. During the night, Naeli dreamed of the desert. She saw herself running through wide open spaces, her feet barely touching the earth, the wind carrying her hair and the scent of sage around her. She saw mountains rising in the distance, rivers sparkling in the sunlight, and her people waiting for her at the edge of the forests. Her dreams were filled with freedom and hope, a stark contrast to the harsh days she had endured in the camp. Even in her sleep, her determination to survive and reclaim her life grew stronger. The next morning, Naeli awoke feeling stronger than she had in weeks. Her body still ached, but the simple meal and warm bed had given her energy to think clearly again. She sat by the window watching the sun rise over the desert landscape. The colors were brilliant, reds, oranges, and golds blending together in a way that reminded her of her childhood, of time spent exploring the land with her family, the beauty of the world.
Outside, the cabin filled her with renewed hope and determination.
Jeremiah prepared breakfast, and the two of them ate quietly, the silence comfortable and full of understanding. Naeli realized that trust was growing between them, even if slowly.
She did not yet share all the details of her journey, but she knew she could rely on his kindness to help her regain strength and plan her next move.
The cabin had become a temporary sanctuary, a place where she could recover and think clearly without the constant threat of capture looming over her. After breakfast, Naeli and Jeremiah began to talk more about her next steps. She knew she could not stay at the cabin forever. The soldiers who had captured her might still be searching. She needed to find her way back to the Apache lands, to her people, and to the freedom that had been taken from her. Jeremiah listened carefully, offering advice and guidance, but he also respected her independence. He understood that she had survived because of her own strength and intelligence, and he did not want to take that from her. Naeli spent the day resting, regaining her strength, and learning from Jeremiah about life in the wilderness. He showed her where water could be found, which plants were safe to eat, and how to move quietly through the desert. She absorbed every piece of information, knowing it could save her life. She also practiced moving lightly and quietly around the cabin, testing her balance and endurance. Every small step was a preparation for the journey ahead. By evening, Naeli felt ready to continue. She packed a small bundle of food, water, and herbs, and thanked Jeremiah for his help. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she also knew that she was stronger and more prepared than ever. The cabin had been a place of rest and healing, a reminder that even in a harsh world, kindness and safety could be found. As she stepped outside, the desert stretched before her, vast and untamed. The mountains in the distance called to her, a promise of home and freedom. Naeli took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the strength in her legs. She began to walk, each step a mixture of determination, hope, and courage. The world was still full of challenges, but she knew she could face them. For the first time in months, Naeli felt a sense of true freedom. She had escaped the camp, survived the desert, and found help when she needed it most. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but she had proven to herself that she was capable of facing anything. With every step, she moved closer to her people, to her land, and to the life she had been denied for so long. And so, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, Naeli walked forward, her spirit unbroken, her heart full of hope, and her eyes fixed on the path to freedom. She knew that challenges still awaited her, but she also knew that she had the strength, courage, and determination to overcome them. The desert stretched out before her, but it was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of possibility, of survival, and of hope. Naeli walked through the desert as the sun climbed high in the sky, her body stronger now from the rest at Jeremiah's cabin. Her feet pressed into the hot sand, but each step felt lighter than before. She carried only a small bundle of food, water, and herbs, but inside her chest, hope beat strongly. The world beyond the camp stretched out endlessly, wild and untamed, but it no longer felt frightening. Every hill, every rock, every tree whispered of freedom, and Naeli had learned to listen. She moved cautiously, avoiding the main paths where soldiers or settlers might pass. Her knowledge of the land guided her. Small creek beds, shaded valleys, and hidden paths through rocky terrain became her allies. She paused occasionally to drink from a hidden spring, her senses alert to every sound, the rustle of animals, the movement of the wind, even distant voices carried by the air. Naeli knew she could not afford carelessness. The desert was beautiful, but could be unforgiving to anyone unprepared. Memories of the camp lingered in her mind. She remembered the fear, the harsh labor, and the endless days of watching others lose hope. Those memories fueled her determination. She thought of her family, her people, and the land she had been taken from. Naeli promised herself that she would survive not only for herself, but for them as well. She would carry their stories, their strength, and their spirit with her as she made her way home. As she walked, Naeli noticed small signs of life around her, the tracks of deer, the movement of birds, and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. She used these signs to navigate, finding paths that offered safety and access to water. Her senses were sharper than ever, trained by months in the camp and days in the desert. She moved like a shadow, careful and deliberate, learning to balance speed with caution. Each step brought her closer to her goal, and each small success strengthened her confidence. On the second day of her journey, Naeli encountered a narrow canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, jagged and shadowed, but the path through it offered shelter from the sun. She moved carefully, pressing close to the rocky walls, listening for any sign of danger. The canyon was silent except for the distant call of a hawk and the occasional rustle of small animals. Naeli felt a thrill of excitement. She was deep in the wilderness, far from the camp, and every step was a triumph of her skill and determination. As she continued, Nayeli came across a small grove of trees near a stream. The shade was a blessing, and the water clear and cool. She knelt by the stream, washing the dust and sweat from her face, and drank deeply. The water revived her, and she took a moment to rest, feeling the strength returning to her limbs. She ate a few berries from the bushes nearby, savoring their sweetness. In these quiet moments, Nayeli felt a connection to the land, a reminder of the world she had been taken from and the life she hoped to reclaim. The days passed slowly but steadily. Nayeli traveled mostly in the early morning and late afternoon, resting during the hottest parts of the day. She used every skill she had learned to move quietly and efficiently, avoiding both human settlements and the dangers of the wilderness. She noticed small details, a particular type of rock that marked a safe path, a bird that signaled nearby water, or a tree whose shade offered shelter from the sun. These observations became part of her survival strategy, and she felt a growing sense of confidence in her ability to navigate the world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nayeli climbed a small hill to look out over the land ahead. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple, and the distant mountains glowed softly in the fading light. She could see the forests and rivers she had known as a child, the lands her people had always called home. A deep sense of joy filled her chest. The journey had been long and difficult, but she was getting closer. Her heart swelled with the thought of reuniting with her tribe, of walking freely once again in the land she loved. That night, Nayeli slept under the stars, using a small blanket to protect herself from the cool desert air. She dreamed of her family and her people, of laughter, songs, and the warm embrace of home. Her dreams were filled with hope, and she woke in the morning with renewed determination. The path ahead was still long, but she knew that she had the strength, skill, and courage to continue. Each day was a step closer to freedom, and she moved forward with a steady, unwavering resolve. During the following days, Nayeli faced new challenges. She had to cross a wide, dry riverbed, the sun beating down relentlessly. Her water was low, and the journey was exhausting. But she reminded herself of the skills she had learned from her ancestors and from Jeremiah. She moved carefully, taking frequent rests in the shade of rocks and using the terrain to her advantage. She drank only small sips from her remaining water, rationing it carefully. Her body ached, but her spirit remained strong. But along the way, Nayeli encountered signs that she was nearing human settlements. She tread cautiously, knowing that not all people would be friendly. She moved quietly, staying hidden in the bushes and behind rocks. Yet she also saw signs of kindness in the world. Small gardens tended near the edges of towns, smoke rising from chimneys, and trails that seemed welcoming. These signs reminded her that the world was not entirely cruel, and that help and safety could sometimes be found even in unexpected places. On the 5th day of her journey, Nayeli reached a ridge overlooking a valley. The view took her breath away. Below, she could see the lands of her people, forests and rivers stretching out in every direction. The sight filled her with both relief and joy. She knew that the hardest part of her journey was over. The desert had tested her, challenged her, and taught her patience and resilience. Now, the land she loved lay just ahead, waiting for her return. As she descended into the valley, Nayeli moved carefully, but with excitement. Every step brought her closer to home, to her tribe, and to the people she had longed to see. She remembered the stories of her ancestors, the lessons of courage, and the importance of perseverance. These teachings guided her now, giving her strength and clarity as she navigated the forests and rivers of her homeland. Finally, after days of travel, Nayeli emerged from the trees and saw the familiar signs of her village. Smoke rose from small fires, and the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted through the air. Her heart raced with anticipation and joy. She had survived the camp, escaped the desert, and returned to the lands of her people. Tears filled her eyes as she took in the familiar sights, the trees, the rivers, and the mountains. Everything she had fought for, every step of her journey, had led to this moment. Nayeli ran the final distance, her feet moving swiftly over the soft earth. As she approached, her family and tribe noticed her. Faces that had been filled with grief and worry lit up with recognition and joy. Her mother, younger brother, and elders ran to meet her, embracing her tightly. Nayeli's heart swelled with happiness as she felt the warmth and love she had missed for so long. She had returned not just to the land but to the people who were her heart and her home. The village celebrated her return, and Nayeli shared her story with those who would listen. She spoke of the camp, the hardships, and the courage it had taken to survive. She spoke of the desert, the guidance of Jeremiah, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Her words were filled with strength and hope, reminding everyone that even in the darkest times, perseverance and courage could lead to freedom and renewal. Days turned into weeks, and Nayeli reintegrated into her tribe. She helped care for her younger brother, worked alongside other women, and shared her knowledge of the land with children and elders alike. Her experiences had made her stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. She knew that life would continue to have challenges, but she also knew that she could face them. The land she loved, the people she cherished, and the spirit of her ancestors were with her always. Nayeli often thought of Jeremiah, the man who had helped her when she was at her weakest. She hoped he was safe and well, and she carried the memory of his kindness in her heart. His help had reminded her that the world could be kind even when it seemed harsh. She knew that kindness, courage, and determination were powerful forces, and she vowed to live her life guided by these principles. The sun set over the village, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. Nayeli stood at the edge of the forest, looking out over the land that had always been hers. The journey had been long, difficult, and full of challenges, but she had survived. She had reclaimed her freedom, returned to her people, and learned the strength that lay within her. A deep sense of peace and accomplishment filled her heart. As night fell, Nayeli sat by the river, listening to the gentle flow of water and the songs of birds settling in for the night. The stars above shone brightly, just as they had during her time in the desert. She whispered a silent prayer of gratitude to her ancestors, thanking them for guiding her, protecting her, and giving her the courage to endure. Nayeli knew that her story was one of survival, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of her people. She had faced the harshest challenges, escaped danger, and found help when she needed it most. She had endured the desert, crossed rivers, and navigated forests, all while keeping her heart focused on home. Nayeli's journey had tested her in every way, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and full of hope. She knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but she was ready to face them, guided by the lessons of the past and the love of her people. In the days that followed, Nayeli became a source of inspiration for her tribe. Her story of courage, patience, and determination spread throughout the community. Children listened wide-eyed as she recounted the lessons of survival in the desert, the careful planning needed to escape the camp, and the kindness she had received along the way. Elders nodded in recognition of her bravery, and parents saw in her example the strength that lay within their own children. Nayeli had not only survived, she had thrived. She had returned to her people, reclaimed her place in the land, and shared her story so that future generations could learn from her experiences. Her spirit remained unbroken, her heart filled with hope, and her mind focused on the future. The desert, the camp, and the cabin had tested her in ways she had never imagined, but they had also shaped her into a strong, resourceful, and courageous woman. And so, Nayeli stood at the edge of the river, looking out at the mountains that had always been home. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth, and the world felt alive and full of possibility. She had endured, she had survived, and she had returned. Her journey was a testament to the power of courage, hope, and determination. Nayeli knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had the strength to face them, guided by the love of her people, the lessons of her ancestors, and the unyielding spirit that had carried her through the desert and back home.